Can you explain me the difference between simple, complex and compound sentences?
I'd like to talk about simple, compound, and complex sentences. But first, let's begin by noticing what is not a sentence. Look at these four examples. Sun, the sun shining, the sun hot. None of these four examples contains a conjugated verb, and so therefore they cannot be considered sentences. The sun shining looks like it might contain a verb because shining is the present participle of the verb shine, but without an auxiliary it is not a complete verb, it is not a conjugated verb, and therefore this cannot be a sentence. So how can we make these into sentences? Well, we need to add a conjugated verb. The sun is hot is a complete sentence. The sun is shining is a complete sentence also, because now each of them contains a conjugated verb, in this case the verb to be conjugated as is. Alright, so now we know what is not a sentence. Let's look at three sentence types: the simple sentence, the compound sentence, and the complex sentence. And we'll begin with some definitions. The simple sentence is, at its heart, a subject and a verb with or without a complement. A compound sentence has two or more simple sentences joined with punctuation and a coordinator, and a complex sentence has an independent idea and a dependent idea joined together in a single sentence. So, a simple sentence might be something like, she smiled. A compound sentence would be, she smiled and she laughed. A complex sentence would have to have a dependent idea. So, something like, she smiles when she is happy. Notice that when she is happy is not a complete idea. It depends upon the rest of the sentence to make sense. And that's the essence of the complex sentence. Let's look in a little bit more detail. A simple sentence, as I said, must have a subject and a predicate. The subject of a sentence is the beer or the doer of that sentence, and the predicate is some message about that subject. So it could be just a verb, or it could be a verb and an object, or what we'll just call the complement. Let's look at an example. Here are two simple sentences. Centuries passed, and number two, London frightened him. Now, centuries is our subject for the first example, and past is the verb. Together, we have a subject and a predicate. We call this the simple sentence. London frightened him. We have a subject, a verb, and a complement. In this case, the object of the verb. London is the subject, frightened is the verb, and him we'll call the complement. Now, sometimes we want to add a little bit more to the simple sentence and delay getting to the action straight away. And we can do this with something called an anticipation. Let's look at one here. After skirting the river for 3 or 4 miles, I found a rickety footbridge. Now, the simple sentence is, I found a rickety footbridge, but it comes with this delay, with this anticipatory phrase, after skirting the river for 3 or 4 miles. Notice how the anticipation is set off from the rest of the sentence with a comma. In the next sentence, our next example, the comma is missing. Even after dark, the touch of the wind has the warmth of flesh. Even after dark, the touch of the wind has the warmth of flesh. Let's do a bit of analysis here. I've put the anticipation in green, and you'll notice in the first sentence it continues all the way up to the comma. The subject of the sentence is I, the verb found, and the complement a rickety footbridge. In the second sentence there is no comma, but we can tell that even after dark is the anticipation because it comes before the subject of our sentence, the touch of the wind. And then our verb has and a complement, the warmth of flesh. Now we don't have to put this additional information always at the beginning of the sentence. Sometimes we may want to put it in the middle, in which case it's not an anticipation, it's an interruption. Let's have a look at an interruption. Here's one from John Updike. A barn in day is a small night. Here's another one. It doesn't seem like an interruption because it seems so integral to the sentence, but if you look closely, there is an interruption also. The thought of her was like champagne itself. The thought of her was like champagne itself. Let's do some analysis. So I've put the interruption in green in both cases. In the first sentence, a barn, that's our subject. Is the verb. A small night is the complement. And you'll notice that in day is surrounded by commas and set off from the rest of the sentence. And that's our interruption. In the second example, without commas, it's difficult to see that there's an interruption, but it's there nonetheless. The thought is our subject. Was is the verb. Like champagne itself is the complement. And the interruption of her is inserted without commas. Now, just as we can have an anticipation and an interruption, we can also have an afterthought. Here are two sentences with afterthoughts. The steadiest winds are the trades, blowing diagonally toward the equator from the northeast and the southwest. Notice that the sentence could be ended right after the word trades. It would still qualify as a simple sentence, but the author has decided to add some more information, blowing diagonally toward the equator from the northeast and the southwest. Here's a second example. There are our young barbarians all at play. Notice all at play seems to be added to the end of the sentence as an afterthought. Let's do some analysis and look at this a bit more closely. The subject of the first sentence, the steadiest winds, is marked in red here, followed immediately by the verb and the complement. So the verb is are and the complement, the trades. After that we have a comma setting the afterthought apart from the rest of the sentence, with comma blowing diagonally toward the equator from the northeast and the southwest. Here the afterthought is very clear and very distinct from the simple sentence. Let's look at the next sentence. Here we have what we call an existential sentence. It begins with the word there. We'll call that our subject. Are as our verb. Our young barbarians is the complement. And here we can end the sentence if we wish. But no, we've added an afterthought with all at play. Here the author Matthew Arnold has decided not to use a comma, even though he has included an afterthought at the end of his sentence. He trusts that the reader will understand how the afterthought is related to the rest of the sentence. Here you might be thinking that one could add one afterthought after another indefinitely, and you'd be right. In such a situation, we call this the elaborated simple sentence. And here's an example. The gulls went in slanting flight upwind toward the grey, desolate east. We'll do some analysis on this. The gulls, that's our subject, went is the verb, and in fact we could stop right there and have a simple sentence. But instead we have in slanting flight upwind toward the grey, desolate east as a series of afterthoughts. Stephen Crane, our author, has decided to add a number of different modifying phrases to the end of the sentence to elaborate the simple sentence into something quite long, but still very well written. And you can too. Now, at its core, we have the simple sentence, the subject and the verb, sometimes with a complement, sometimes without. And all we have to do to make a compound sentence is to join two or more of them together. Here we have a compound sentence. The great tragic artists of the world are four, and three of them are Greek. Notice how these two simple sentences are joined with comma and. We could remove them and have two separate sentences as the great tragic artists of the world are four, three of them are Greek, but since these two sentences are closely related and have a logical connection one to the other, we are perhaps better off joining them together with the comma and the conjunction and make a compound sentence out of the two. And this is just what Edith Hamilton has done in her book, The Greek Way. Let's do some analysis. We have a sentence in red and a sentence in blue, and they're joined with a comma and a coordinator. The great tragic artists of the world are four, comma, and three of them are Greek. Here we have a compound sentence made up of two simple sentences joined with a comma and a coordinator, and the coordinator is and. Are there other coordinators that we could use? Let's have a look. Here are four: and, or, so, or but. Now let's turn our attention to the complex sentence. Let's look at an example. If there is magic on this planet, it is contained in water. Let's have a look a bit more closely. The first part of the sentence begins with a subordinator and a dependent clause. The subordinator is if. The dependent clause, there is magic on this planet. Then we have a comma separating this anticipation from the rest of the sentence. And then we have the independent clause, it is contained in water. Here is a complex sentence with an interruption. Richard's crown, which he wore to the last, was picked out of a bush and placed on the victor's head. Let's look a little bit more closely. As you can see, the interruption appears in the middle of the sentence, and it's surrounded by commas to set it apart from the rest. We have Richard's crown, which is our subject, was picked out of a bush and placed on the victor's head, which is the rest of the independent clause, but in the middle, set apart with commas, you have which he wore to the last. This phrase, this dependent clause, interrupts the sentence to give us a bit more information. Just as we can have an anticipation and an interruption, we can also have an afterthought with a complex sentence. Here's a complex sentence with an afterthought. Avery had decided definitely on Princeton, even though he would be the only boy entering that year from St. Regis. We'll look a bit more closely. Even though is our subordinator. We have a comma, and then the subordinator, and then a dependent clause. Even though he would be the only boy entering that year from St. Regis. The independent clause comes first. Avery had decided definitely on Princeton. Notice how the comma lets us know where the independent clause ends and the dependent clause begins with the subordinator even though. Here are some other subordinators that you can use. Although, as if, so, so that, because, before, after, if, since, that, until, unless, when, where, who, whom, where, and which. Alright, now it's time for the test. Can you identify simple, compound, and complex sentences? I'll read a sentence and you say simple, compound, or complex. Ready? Sentence number 1. My name is Nick. Simple. My name, if you must know, is Nick. Complex. Notice how if you must know is a dependent clause and it comes as an interruption. My children's names are Audrey and Julian. Simple. Don't be confused by the and at the end. My children's names is the subject, are is the verb, Audrey and Julian comes as the complement. Julian is a boy and Audrey is a girl. Compound. Notice how Julian is the first subject, Julian is a boy, and Audrey is our second subject, Audrey is a girl. And the two sentences are joined together with comma and. Crazy kids. This is a sentence fragment, isn't it? In fact, it's not a sentence at all. Audrey, I want you to say a sentence for me. Say this.
Sun.
That's not a sentence, is it, Julian?
No.
Thumbs down. Okay, let's try another one.